Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Some crimes are so unsettling that they linger in the mind long after they've occurred. Tonight, we'll be taking a calm but detailed journey through the tragic and horrifying murder of Iryna Zarutska. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Alright, let's get into the video. Imagine fleeing war-torn Ukraine to build a new life in America, only to have it brutally taken away on a public train ride home from work. This is the tragic story of Iryna Zarutska, a 23-year-old refugee whose dreams of becoming a veterinary assistant ended in a random, unprovoked attack that shocked a nation and exposed critical gaps in our transit safety systems. Picture your entire existence reduced to whatever you can carry as air raid sirens echo through city streets. Iryna Zarutska knew this reality firsthand. Her life in Kyiv shifting from art studies and family dinners to survival mode overnight. The invasion forced impossible choices that refugees around the world understand too well. What to take, what to leave behind, and how to protect loved ones when protection feels impossible. Her journey through Europe's refugee processing systems meant temporary shelters, bureaucratic delays, and the constant hum of uncertainty. She moved through way stations and resettlement centers, each one a pause between the life she'd lost and the one she hoped to build. The paperwork, the interviews, the waiting, it all formed a bridge between trauma and tentative hope. When she finally arrived in the United States, she carried little more than determination. No family heirlooms, no childhood photos, just the clothes she wore and the resolve to start over. That blank slate held both promise and profound loneliness. She faced not only a new language, but new customs, new social cues, an entirely unfamiliar way of life. Yet Iryna adapted with remarkable speed. She approached English not as a barrier, but as a tool, practicing with coworkers, watching television, immersing herself in the rhythm of American speech. This wasn't just about learning words, it was about learning how to belong. Her background in art gave her a unique perspective. She noticed details, patterns, the way light falls differently in a new country. She saw rebuilding as a form of creation. Beneath that resilience lay the quiet weight of displacement. The memories of air raids, the ghost of home left behind, the ache of separation from everything familiar. She carried these silently, folding them into her daily routine like worn photographs kept in a pocket. Starting over meant confronting not just practical challenges, but psychological ones, the dissonance between who she had been and who she was becoming. Her artistic training shaped her approach to this new chapter. Where others saw obstacles, she saw composition. She arranged her small apartment with care, chose her routines deliberately, approached her veterinary studies with the same patience she once applied to canvases. There was a method to her reinvention, a deliberate craftsmanship to building a life from fragments. That transformation from war refugee to aspiring veterinary assistant became her story's central arc. She wasn't just surviving. She was carefully, thoughtfully reassembling herself. Her connection to animals felt like a universal language, one that didn't require translation. In caring for creatures who couldn't speak her language, she found a purpose that transcended borders. This represents the refugee experience at its most courageous. Not just escape, but reinvention. Not just safety, but meaning. Iryna embodied that fragile, powerful hope that defines so many who leave everything behind for a chance at something new. Her story wasn't about forgetting the past, but about building a future worthy of the sacrifice it took to get there. Imagine packing a single suitcase containing everything that remains of your life. You cannot say goodbye to your home, your city, or the future you planned. You simply leave, not knowing when or if you will ever return. This was the reality for Iryna Zarutska and her family when they fled Kyiv in 2022. Before the invasion, Iryna's life centered on art, education, and her tight-knit family. She was a university student studying art restoration, a field that requires patience, precision, and a deep respect for preserving what matters. Her life in Kyiv was not just about classes and exams. It was about friendships, family dinners, and the quiet confidence of building a future in the city she called home. Then the rockets began to fall. The life she knew vanished almost overnight. The journey out of Ukraine was a blur of checkpoints, temporary shelters, and overwhelming uncertainty. Each step farther from home carried the weight of irreversible loss. Her degree in art restoration suddenly represented a future that was no longer possible, a career path interrupted by forces far beyond her control. Like more than 100,000 other Ukrainian refugees who entered the United States that year, Iryna's family arrived with little more than documents and determination. They settled in Charlotte, North Carolina, a city far from everything familiar. The challenges were immediate and constant. Language barriers made simple tasks difficult. Cultural differences created moments of confusion and isolation. The contrast between her life in Kyiv and her new reality in America could not have been sharper. From a university student with a clear path, she became a newcomer starting from zero. Yet Iryna approached this monumental reset with quiet resolve. She began learning English with focused intensity, practicing with coworkers, neighbors, and anyone willing to converse. Within months, she secured a job at a local pizzeria, taking on shifts that required physical stamina and constant interaction with the public. Her coworkers noted her work ethic and her surprisingly quick adaptation to this new environment. She wasn't just going through the motions. She was rebuilding. This resilience, this ability to absorb shock and keep moving forward, made what happened next even more difficult to comprehend. The same determination that brought her across an ocean and into a new life would be met with a violence she never could have anticipated. Now consider the daily reality of building life from nothing. Iryna's routine in Charlotte followed a rhythm familiar to many immigrants. Early mornings, long days, quiet nights. She balanced community college courses with work shifts, each hour accounted for, each dollar assigned a purpose. This wasn't just a schedule. It was a structure built to hold a new identity. Her English improved through sheer immersion. She listened carefully to customers at work, repeating phrases under her breath. She watched local news broadcasts, not just for information, but for cadence. Language became a practical tool, not an academic exercise. Each conversation was a small victory, each unfamiliar idiom a puzzle to solve. The pizzeria job provided more than income. It offered routine, human contact, a place where she belonged. Co-workers became her first American friends, customers, her informal language partners. She learned the rhythm of weekend rushes, the quiet of weekday afternoons, the particular way regulars ordered their meals. This wasn't temporary work. It was her economic anchor. Pet sitting for neighbors opened another door. Animals didn't care about accents or cultural differences. Through caring for pets, she formed connections that bypassed the usual refugee experience of isolation. Homeowners trusted her with keys to their houses, with their beloved animals. These relationships built a network beyond the immigrant community, creating threads of belonging throughout the neighborhood. Her background in artistic restoration influenced everything. She approached veterinary studies with the same meticulous attention to detail she once applied to damaged canvases. Anatomy charts reminded her of technical drawings. Medical procedures followed logical sequences like artistic techniques. She saw healing as another form of restoration, just working with living tissue instead of paint and canvas. Family dynamics played out in quiet ways. Each member adapted differently to American life. Some embraced the new culture quickly, others held tightly to traditions. Iryna navigated these differences with patience, often mediating between generations translating not just language, but customs. Shared displacement created both bonds and tensions within the household. The constant balancing act defined her existence. Immediate needs, rent, groceries, transportation competed with long-term goals like education and career advancement. Every decision carried weight. Take an extra shift for money or study for an exam, socialize with coworkers or help family members. These weren't simple choices. They were calculations about survival versus growth. Her quick adaptation made her stand out. While many refugees struggle for years with culture shock and isolation, Iryna seemed to flourish. She didn't just learn the rules of American life. She learned how to play the game. Small things, understanding tipping culture, navigating public transportation, recognizing regional slang, added up to significant integration. This rapid embrace of American life marked her as someone special. Colleagues noticed her work ethic, teachers her determination, neighbors her kindness. She became the success story people point to when they talk about refugee resilience. Not just surviving, but building. Not just adapting, but belonging. That ability to thrive against overwhelming odds makes what happened next even more difficult to comprehend. Her transformation from war refugee to integrated community member represented the best possible outcome of the immigrant journey. She had done everything right, followed every rule, built something meaningful from nothing. What does it take to rebuild your identity in a foreign country? For Iryna Zarutska, the answer involved a grueling balancing act that would test anyone's limits. She enrolled at Rowan Cabarrus Community College, pursuing veterinary studies while maintaining full-time employment. This meant her days began before sunrise and ended long after dark, a cycle of work, study, and survival that required extraordinary discipline. Her schedule left little room for error or rest. Mornings involved language practice, afternoons shifted to classes, and evenings meant serving customers at Zebedee's Pizzeria. The mental energy required to constantly switch between languages and tasks would exhaust most people. Yet those who worked with her noted her consistent cheerfulness despite these pressures. She never complained about the long hours or the fatigue that must have accompanied them. Neighbors observed how she built connections through small acts of service, particularly through pet sitting. This side work demonstrated both her practicality and her inherent kindness. People trusted her with their homes and animals, recognizing her responsible nature and gentle demeanor. These relationships became informal support networks, creating pockets of community in her new environment. Research shows this pattern is common among refugees establishing themselves in new countries. Multiple low-wage jobs combined with education represent a calculated investment in future stability. The temporary struggle is endured for long-term security, a trade-off made by thousands seeking to rebuild their lives. Iryna's choice to pursue veterinary studies reflected more than career ambition. It mirrored her natural inclination to care for others, just as she had cared for her family through their displacement. Her rapid acquisition of English demonstrated notable cognitive flexibility. She absorbed vocabulary and grammar with focused intensity, practicing with coworkers and customers until her accent softened and her confidence grew. This language mastery wasn't just about communication. It was about belonging, about reducing the distance between herself and her new home. Within months, Iryna had constructed a fragile but functional new life. She had employment, educational goals, community connections, and a clear path forward. This network of support and purpose represented the exact outcome refugee resettlement programs hoped to achieve. Her progress showed what was possible through determination and resilience. This makes what happened next particularly difficult to comprehend. The same public transportation system that represented her independence and mobility would become the site of unimaginable violence. The routine commute home from work, a journey she had made safely countless times, would end not with family or study, but with brutality that shattered every hope she had built. Picture this final shift at the pizzeria. The last normal hours before everything shattered. August 22nd unfolded like any other Friday. The dinner rush building, the familiar rhythm of orders coming in, pizzas going out. Iryna moved through her tasks with the same efficiency she always showed. No premonition, no sense of impending danger. Just another evening earning money to fund her American dream. Her interactions with coworkers followed established patterns. They discussed shift coverage for the coming week, debated the best way to handle a difficult customer, exchanged small talk about weekend plans. These mundane conversations would later become heartbreaking artifacts of a life interrupted. The ordinary concerns that filled those hours, how much tip money she might make, whether she should pick up an extra shift, what she might do on her day off now, carry unbearable weight. Customers encountered the same polite, competent young woman they always saw. Her refugee background shaped these interactions in subtle ways. She brought an extra measure of gratitude to service work, remembering what true hardship felt like. She never treated any order as trivial, any request as unreasonable. This wasn't just a job to her. It was proof she could build something stable in her new country. The decision to take public transit home reflected her normal routine. She could have arranged a ride, called a rideshare, or waited for a coworker heading in the same direction. But the train represented independence, reliability, and economy. She knew the schedule, the stops, the transfer points. Public transportation symbolized the orderly system she had learned to navigate so successfully. Final messages likely passed between her phone and family members. Perhaps she confirmed dinner plans, discussed groceries needed, or simply said she'd be home soon. These digital echoes of ordinary life would later become evidence of last moments. The casual communication people take for granted until it becomes the last communication. Every detail from that shift now exists under a different light. The pizza she ate during her break, the cleaning tasks she completed before clocking out, the final walk through the kitchen checking equipment. These routine actions formed the last chapter of a life built through determination and hope. The normalcy of it all makes the violence that followed feel particularly senseless. She clocked out at the expected time, collected her belongings, said goodbye to coworkers. Nothing in her demeanor suggested apprehension about the journey home. She had made this trip countless times before. The familiarity of the routine provided comfort, not concern. Public transit represented connection, not danger, in her experience. The transition from work to commute happened seamlessly. She left the pizzeria's warmth and noise for the evening air, walking toward the station with the confidence of someone following a well-worn path. Her movements were automatic, thoughtless in the way only repeated routines become. She focused on getting home, resting, preparing for another day of building her future. Those final hours at Zeppedy's represent the life she had fought to create. The ordinary worries, the small frustrations, the minor triumphs of a shift well worked, these were the building blocks of her new existence. She had traded war zones for pizza ovens, air raid sirens for dinner rushes. The violence that ended her life didn't just attack a person. It attacked the very idea of safe, ordinary life she had worked so hard to achieve. The crushing weight of what happened next lies in its contrast with these normal moments. The brutal interruption of a life, finally finding its rhythm. The random destruction of something built through immense effort and courage. This tension between ordinary routine and extraordinary violence forms the heart of the tragedy. How does an ordinary evening become someone's final moments? August 22nd, 2025 appeared to be like any other Friday for Iryna Zarutska. She completed her shift at the pizzeria, following the same routine she had established over months of steady employment. The security footage shows her moving through familiar motions wiping counters, exchanging brief words with coworkers, clocking out at the usual time. There was no indication that this evening would differ from dozens of others. She walked toward the Lynx Blue Line station, as she had countless times before. Public transportation served as her primary means of travel, as it does for many refugees and low-income workers in urban environments. The system represented both independence and necessity, a practical solution for someone building a new life without the resources for personal vehicle ownership. The evening remained warm as she approached the platform. The train arrived with its characteristic hum, doors sliding open to reveal a compartment that wasn't particularly crowded. She stepped inside, likely relieved to be heading home after a long day of work and study. The carriage contained a typical Friday night mix of passengers, some heading home from jobs, others going out for entertainment, most absorbed in their own worlds. She selected a seat in what appeared to be a quiet section of the car. Perhaps she sought a moment of rest before reaching her destination, or maybe she preferred solitude after hours of customer interaction. Other passengers nearby were distracted by phones, conversations, or the city scenery passing outside the windows. Nobody paid particular attention to the young woman taking her seat, just as she likely didn't study those around her. The train began moving, carrying its passengers through the urban landscape. Iryna might have been thinking about her weekend plans, her studies, or simply looking forward to resting at home. The rhythm of the rails provided a familiar backdrop to these final ordinary thoughts. Everything about these moments reflected the normalcy of urban commuting, the slight sway of the car, the intermittent station announcements, the collective silence of tired people traveling together yet apart. Research into public transit patterns shows that riders often develop routines that make them feel secure. They choose specific cars, select particular seats, follow set patterns of behavior. These habits create a sense of control in environments that are inherently public and unpredictable. Iryna's actions that evening followed this pattern of established routine, the comfort of familiarity in an unfamiliar land. The security cameras continued recording, capturing these last moments of normalcy. The timestamps would later reveal that exactly 4 minutes elapsed between her boarding and the beginning of the attack. 4 minutes that started with routine and ended with catastrophe. The complete ordinariness of these final moments, the lack of warning, the absence of tension, the everyday quality of everything makes the violence that followed particularly difficult to process. We often look for signs in retrospect, searching for something that might have predicted the tragedy. But the footage shows only normalcy, only routine, only the unremarkable beginning of a commute home. That very normalcy becomes the most haunting aspect when we know how the story ends. Now consider the transition from workplace normalcy to public transit vulnerability. The station presented a familiar urban landscape: concrete platforms, timetable displays, the distant hum of approaching trains. Evening passengers moved with the tired determination of people heading home after long days. Students with backpacks, service workers in uniforms, a few late commuters checking phones. This was the typical demographic mix, each person wrapped in their own world. The security measures followed standard transit protocols. Cameras monitored platforms and train entrances. Emergency call boxes stood at regular intervals. Occasional transit police patrols moved through stations. But these were passive protections, reactive rather than preventive. They documented crimes rather than preventing them, captured evidence rather than ensuring safety. The system relied on visibility to deter trouble, not intervention to stop it. At approximately 9:30 p.m., the train arrived with its characteristic electric hum. Iryna boarded through the nearest doors, following the routine she had established over months of commuting. The car selection appeared random, but followed patterns of habit. She chose a seat away from the busier sections, perhaps seeking quiet after a noisy shift. This placement would prove critically important. Other passengers occupied the car in typical configurations. Some sat near doors for quick exits, others in middle sections for stability during movement. Most engaged with phones or stared out windows, their attention turned inward. This level of distraction represented normal commuting behavior people, conserving emotional energy, disengaging from their surroundings until reaching their destinations. The transit system's camera coverage provided comprehensive visual documentation. Cameras mounted at both ends of each car captured wide angles of passenger areas. Monitoring occurred from a central control room where staff watched multiple feeds simultaneously. The protocol required documentation rather than live intervention. Operators could alert transit police, but could not directly communicate with trains or passengers. This commute represented both independence and vulnerability for Iryna. Public transportation symbolized her successful adaptation to American life navigating schedules, understanding routes, moving confidently through urban spaces. Yet it also placed her in a shared space with strangers, relying on systems and norms rather than personal protection. The train car became a microcosm of public life, both connecting and exposing. The seating choice placed her in a relatively isolated position, not completely alone, but not within immediate reach of multiple potential helpers either. This middle ground location created a buffer zone where actions might go unnoticed for critical seconds. The typical commuter's desire for personal space inadvertently created pockets of vulnerability within public transportation. The environmental factors worked against quick intervention. Train noise masked initial sounds of struggle. Passenger distraction delayed recognition of emergency situations. The physical layout of seats created sightline obstacles. These ordinary elements of public transit design suddenly became liabilities when violence erupted. The system's security model assumed rational actors and visible threats. It didn't account for sudden, unpredictable violence from seemingly ordinary passengers. The protocols focused on property crimes, disorderly conduct, and visible weapons, not concealed knives and immediate attacks. This gap in emergency planning would prove devastating. Iryna's decision to sit away from the crowd reflected normal commuting behavior. People naturally seek space and quiet after work. They avoid crowded sections, choose seats with empty neighbors, create small zones of privacy in public spaces. This completely reasonable choice unfortunately placed her in a position where help would take precious extra seconds to arrive. The tragedy of this moment lies in its ordinary beginnings. Nothing about her actions suggested danger. She followed the same patterns millions of commuters follow daily. The systems around her functioned as designed. The other passengers behaved normally. Yet this very normalcy created the conditions for catastrophe. The attack that followed would test every assumption about public safety and emergency response. What can happen in the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee? Modern security cameras provided a devastating answer, their timestamps tracking each second of horror. The footage shows DeCarlos Brown Jr. rising from his seat, producing a knife, and launching an unprovoked assault. He moved without warning, without provocation, without hesitation. The attack began in complete silence, no argument preceding it, no tension building toward violence. Iryna had no reason to anticipate danger from a stranger she'd never met. The first stab caught her completely by surprise. There was no time to react, no opportunity to defend herself or call for help. The initial thrust set the pattern for what followed, swift, deliberate, and brutally efficient. Multiple attacks came in rapid succession, each movement calculated to cause maximum damage. The final wound targeted her neck, severing critical arteries and ensuring this would not be survivable. The entire sequence unfolded with clinical precision, as if following some internal script only the attacker could hear. Research into transit violence confirms how quickly these situations develop. Most attacks occur within moments, leaving little time for bystander intervention or emergency response. The compressed time frame creates a terrible paradox. By the time witnesses process what's happening, the violence is often already concluded. This rapid escalation leaves everyone reacting to events rather than preventing them. Other passengers initially froze in shock. The suddenness of the violence created a momentary paralysis, minds struggling to accept what eyes were seeing. Some eventually attempted to render aid, but the severity of the wounds made effective assistance impossible. The confined space of the train car limited movement and access, creating additional barriers to helping. Well-intentioned efforts faced overwhelming medical reality. Witness statements consistently noted the attacker's emotional state. He showed no anger, no panic, no visible emotion whatsoever. The assault proceeded with mechanical detachment, as if performing a task rather than committing violence. This absence of affect made the events even more disturbing to those who witnessed them. The combination of extreme violence and emotional blankness created a surreal, nightmare quality to the entire event. Iryna bled out on the train floor before medical help could arrive. The nature of her injuries meant that even immediate expert care might not have saved her. The location of the attack, a moving train between stations, created inevitable delays in emergency response. Paramedics reached the scene quickly, but faced a situation already beyond medical intervention. This footage would become central to both the criminal investigation and subsequent public outrage. The visual evidence provided undeniable proof of what occurred, eliminating any doubt about the attack's nature or severity. Prosecutors would use it to demonstrate intent and establish timeline. Media outlets would debate the ethics of broadcasting such graphic content. The public would struggle to reconcile the ordinary setting with the extraordinary violence it contained. The 4-minute timestamp reveals how quickly safety can evaporate. The transition from routine commute to lethal violence required less time than most people spend choosing a morning beverage. This compression of time becomes one of the most frightening aspects, the realization that ordinary life can transform into nightmare in moments. The security footage provides a terrible lesson in how little time exists between safety and catastrophe in public spaces. That visual record would shape everything that followed: legal strategy, public perception, policy discussions. It made the abstract concrete, the statistical personal. 4 minutes of violence would echo through courtrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms, becoming a reference point for discussions about transit safety, mental health care, and random violence. The footage ensured nobody could look away from what happened on that train. How do ordinary people respond to extraordinary violence? As the train continued moving, passengers struggled to process what their eyes had just witnessed. The aftermath unfolded in fragmented moments of confusion and horror. Some individuals moved toward Iryna, attempting to provide whatever aid they could offer. Others backed away, seized by fear or uncertainty about how to help. Several called emergency services, their voices strained with the effort of describing the indescribable. The compartment became a mosaic of human reaction: compassion, terror, paralysis, action. The attacker remained on the train until it reached the next station. He made no attempt to flee or conceal himself, showing the same emotional detachment witnesses noted during the assault. Police officers boarded and detained him without resistance. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos he had created, adding another layer of surrealism to the scene. The transition from violence to arrest happened with procedural efficiency, as if following some grim script. Paramedics arrived within minutes of the emergency call. They faced injuries too severe for field treatment. The nature of the wounds, particularly the neck injury, meant survival was impossible outside hospital trauma centers. Medical personnel performed standard procedures, but recognized the futility of their efforts. Iryna was declared dead at the scene, her body remaining as evidence while investigators documented everything. Research into traumatic events shows how crisis triggers varied psychological responses. Fight, flight, freeze reactions manifest differently in each person. Some passengers provided detailed statements to police immediately. Others required medical evaluation for shock. A few reported memory gaps or distorted recollections of the event sequence. This range of reactions reflects how human brains process extreme stress, prioritizing survival over accurate recording. Transit officials sealed the entire car as a crime scene. The Blue Line experienced significant disruptions as police secured evidence and interviewed witnesses. Normal service halted for hours, creating transportation headaches throughout the system. Commuters found alternate routes home, many unaware of the tragedy unfolding on their usual line. The practical consequences of violent crime extend beyond immediate victims to entire communities. Initial police reports characterized the attack as random and without apparent motive. This classification acknowledged the absence of prior contact between perpetrator and victim. The randomness became a central point of public concern. If violence could strike anyone, anywhere, then nobody was truly safe. This perception would later fuel debates about public security and mental health systems. By morning, Iryna's death had become another homicide statistic for Charlotte. The bureaucratic process of investigation, evidence collection, and legal proceedings began its methodical pace. Each step transformed a human tragedy into case numbers, court dates, and official documents. The personal horror of those 4 minutes became absorbed into systems designed to process crime rather than comprehend loss. The randomness of the violence would dominate public discussion in coming weeks. If someone could be attacked without warning by a complete stranger, then safety became an illusion. This realization sparked examinations of transit security, mental health care, and public space design. The attack challenged assumptions about urban safety and community protection, forcing uncomfortable questions about how society handles unpredictable violence. Now consider how quickly safety disappears in public spaces. The train moved through the city with its usual rhythm, passengers swaying gently with the motion. Most people stared at phones or out windows, lost in private thoughts. The atmosphere held the familiar disengagement of evening commutes, people physically together, but mentally separate. This collective inattention created conditions where violence could erupt unnoticed for critical seconds. The suspect boarded at a station stop, moving through the car with apparent purpose. His path took him directly toward Iryna's section. Security footage shows no interaction between them prior to the attack, no exchanged words or gestures. He approached her seat without hesitation, his movement deliberate, but not obviously threatening. The complete absence of provocation makes what followed even more disturbing. The knife appeared suddenly, produced from clothing or a bag. Its emergence marked the instant transition from routine commute to life-threatening violence. The weapon's size and type would later become important evidence, but in that moment, it represented pure danger. The production of the blade signaled intent that bypassed warning or negotiation. The attack unfolded with brutal efficiency. Multiple stab wounds landed in rapid succession, each strike calculated to cause maximum damage. The movements were precise, practiced, delivered with force that overcame any possibility of defense. The time frame compressed horror into moments, seconds that felt like minutes to witnesses, but passed too quickly for intervention. The fatal neck wound changed everything. This particular injury crossed a medical threshold where survival becomes nearly impossible outside immediate surgical intervention. Arterial damage, airway compromise, rapid blood loss. These technical terms describe a biological reality that meant even perfect emergency response might not have saved her. The attack's brutality ensured this wouldn't be a survivable assault. From boarding to completed attack, exactly 4 minutes. The security footage timestamps create a devastating timeline. 140 seconds of normal commute, then 40 seconds of violence, then 40 seconds of aftermath. This compression of tragedy into such a brief window illustrates how quickly lives can be destroyed in public spaces. The suddenness overwhelmed bystander capacity to respond. Human reaction time, processing unusual events, deciding to intervene. These cognitive steps require seconds that weren't available. The attack's speed and brutality created paralysis among witnesses. People saw violence but couldn't immediately comprehend its scale or nature. The security footage reveals details that make intervention practically impossible. The attacker's body position blocked easy access. The confined space limited movement. The element of surprise gave him control of the situation before anyone recognized the danger. These physical and psychological factors combined to create a scenario where help couldn't arrive in time. The violence represented complete rupture from normal expectations. Public transit operates on social contracts about behavior and safety. This attack shattered those assumptions instantly. The train car became a crime scene. The commute became a tragedy. Ordinary passengers became witnesses to horror. The transition happened too quickly for anyone to process in the moment. The 4-minute timeline demonstrates a critical vulnerability in public safety systems. Protocols designed for slower developing emergencies couldn't address this rapid violence. Transit security measures focused on prevention rather than immediate response. The system assumed time for intervention that simply didn't exist in this scenario. This brief window of violence would echo through multiple systems: transit security, mental health care, criminal justice. The attack's speed and brutality raised questions no one had answers for. How do you protect against unpredictable violence? How do you intervene in seconds? How do you reconcile public safety with individual freedom? Picture yourself witnessing sudden violence in a confined space. The immediate aftermath of the stabbing created a scene of shock and disbelief. Passengers who moments before were lost in their own thoughts suddenly confronted a reality that felt both surreal and horrifying. The transition from normal commute to emergency situation happened too quickly for anyone to process. People stared, frozen, trying to comprehend what their eyes registered, but their minds refused to accept. The gap between wanting to help and providing effective assistance became immediately apparent. Several passengers moved toward Iryna with clear intentions to render aid, but faced limitations in medical knowledge and resources. Their efforts reflected human compassion, but lacked professional training. They used clothing as makeshift bandages, applied pressure to wounds, spoke reassuring words. These actions demonstrated courage in the face of trauma, but could not address the severity of her injuries. Emergency communication systems within the train car saw immediate use. Passengers activated the intercom system to alert the conductor, called 911 on personal phones, shouted for help through open windows. The response chain began with these first notifications, but each second of delay compounded the crisis. The systems functioned as designed, yet the design assumed scenarios less immediately catastrophic than this. The psychological impact on witnesses unfolded in real time. Some passengers experienced visible shock, others moved with frantic purpose, a few remained paralyzed by fear. The shared experience of witnessing extreme violence created instant bonds between strangers. It also highlighted individual coping mechanisms. These ordinary commuters became involuntary participants in a tragedy that would leave lasting emotional scars. First responders arrived with professional efficiency, but faced a medically hopeless situation. Paramedics performed standard triage procedures, assessing vital signs, attempting interventions, preparing for transport. Their training kicked into automatic mode, checking airways, controlling bleeding, monitoring cardiac activity. Yet their professional assessment would have recognized the grim reality within moments. Certain types of stab wounds present particularly difficult treatment challenges outside hospital settings. Neck injuries involve complex anatomy, where major blood vessels and airways exist in close proximity. Arterial damage causes rapid blood loss that pressure alone cannot stop. Airway compromise requires advanced interventions not available in field conditions. The specific nature of these injuries meant survival required immediate surgical intervention. Emergency medical protocols have clear limitations with penetrating trauma to critical areas. External bleeding represents only part of the problem. Internal damage, air embolism, spinal cord injury, all contribute to poor outcomes. Even with perfect response times and ideal conditions, certain injuries exceed pre-hospital care capabilities. The biological reality of traumatic injury defines what is medically possible. Passenger efforts to help reflected the best of human nature under terrible circumstances. People used their own clothing as bandages, offered words of comfort, created space for medical personnel. These actions provided emotional, if not physical support. The attempt to render aid mattered psychologically, even when it couldn't change the medical outcome. The arrival of official responders shifted the dynamic from citizen intervention to professional management. Police secured the scene. Paramedics took over medical efforts. Transit officials coordinated with emergency services. The transition represented society's structured response to crisis. It also highlighted the limits of that structure when facing certain types of violence. Despite all intervention attempts, the nature of the wounds made death inevitable. The attack's brutality, combined with anatomical vulnerability, created a scenario where even perfect emergency response would likely have failed. This medical reality doesn't diminish the efforts made to save her, but it does underscore the finality of certain types of violence. The scene left witnesses with conflicting emotions: pride in attempted rescue, guilt over perceived inadequacy, trauma from witnessed horror. These psychological echoes would continue long after the physical event concluded. The gap between human compassion and medical reality became painfully clear in those desperate minutes. Who was the person who ended Iryna's journey? The investigation revealed a man whose history intersected with multiple systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. DeCarlos Brown Jr. had been known to mental health services and law enforcement for years, his name appearing in case files and court documents that traced a deteriorating path. His extensive record included convictions for armed robbery, larceny, and breaking and entering offenses that suggested escalating behavior rather than isolated incidents. Family members described watching his mental health unravel over several years. They spoke of schizophrenia diagnoses, hospitalizations, and treatments that never seemed to stick. His reality had become increasingly separated from consensus experience, filled with hallucinations and paranoia that sometimes turned aggressive toward those closest to him. Relatives witnessed the person they knew disappearing behind symptoms that distorted his perception and behavior. Research indicates approximately 1/4 of homeless individuals live with severe mental illness like schizophrenia. This statistic represents real people navigating streets and shelters without adequate treatment or support. Their conditions often go unmanaged, their crises untreated, their needs unmet by systems stretched beyond capacity. The gap between diagnosis and effective care becomes a chasm too wide for many to cross. Previous encounters with police had resulted in involuntary commitments to psychiatric facilities. These interventions followed a predictable pattern: crisis, stabilization, release. Each time he would receive treatment until deemed no longer an immediate danger, then return to the community with limited follow-up care. The system focused on acute episodes rather than long-term management, addressing emergencies without preventing their recurrence. His sister reported pleading with authorities for more comprehensive treatment and supervision. She described trying to navigate bureaucratic hurdles, insurance limitations, and legal restrictions that prevented longer-term interventions. Her advocacy faced constant barriers: confidentiality laws that limited information sharing, eligibility requirements that excluded her brother, waiting lists that stretched for months. She became another family member, watching someone they loved spiral without adequate help. Despite these multiple warning signs, Brown remained free to access public spaces like transit systems. His movement through the city followed patterns common among those with untreated mental illness and housing instability. Public transportation often serves as shelter, transportation, and temporary refuge for people with nowhere else to go. The very systems designed for community connection became spaces of potential risk. This pattern of missed interventions would become a focal point in the tragedy's aftermath. Each encounter with authorities represented a potential turning point that never turned. Each family plea signaled concern that went unheeded. Each hospitalization and release created another cycle of instability. The systems designed to protect both individuals and the public failed to connect in ways that might have prevented catastrophe. The question becomes how someone with this history could reach a point of violence without meaningful intervention. The answer lies in the gaps between systems, between mental health care and law enforcement, between family concerns and legal limitations, between crisis response and preventive care. These structural failures created conditions where tragedy became not just possible, but increasingly probable over time. His story represents thousands of individuals navigating similar challenges across the country. The combination of severe mental illness, housing instability, and criminal history creates a perfect storm of risk factors. Without coordinated, continuous care, the pattern repeats. Crisis, temporary stabilization, deterioration, repeat. The consequences extend beyond the individual to everyone they encounter in public spaces. This case reveals how systems can have all the pieces of a puzzle, yet fail to assemble them into a coherent picture of risk. Information existed in separate files. Concerns remained in different departments. Interventions happened in isolation rather than coordination. The man who boarded that train represented not just individual pathology, but systemic failure. His actions would force examination of how society handles the intersection between illness and public safety. Consider the power of visual evidence in public perception. The security footage existed immediately after the incident, captured by multiple cameras throughout the train car. High-definition lenses provided clear documentation of every movement, every expression, every detail of the attack. This visual record became both crucial evidence and a moral dilemma for authorities. The decision-making process around releasing violent content involves complex considerations. Law enforcement weighed evidentiary integrity against public interest. Prosecutors needed to preserve the footage's value for courtroom proceedings, ensuring it wouldn't be deemed prejudicial or compromised. Simultaneously, they recognized the public's right to understand what occurred on public transportation. The timeline stretched from late August to early September, creating an information vacuum. During these weeks, speculation filled the absence of official visual evidence. Rumors circulated about the attack's nature, the response time, the suspect's behavior. Without concrete visual reference, people constructed narratives based on partial information and personal biases. Law enforcement's primary concern involved protecting the judicial process. Premature release could taint potential jury pools, complicate defendant identification procedures, and create emotional reactions that might influence legal proceedings. They also considered the defense's potential arguments about fair trial rights and media saturation. The delayed release allowed misinformation to flourish across platforms. Social media theories ranged from conspiracy claims to inaccurate descriptions of events. Some suggested the attack was targeted rather than random. Others questioned the response time of transit security. Without the footage's clarifying evidence, these theories gained traction. Technical aspects made the footage particularly disturbing. The clarity showed facial expressions, the precision of movements, the immediate physiological reactions. This wasn't grainy surveillance tape, but high-definition video that captured human agony in detail. The quality that made it valuable evidence also made it potentially traumatizing to view. The ethical debate centered on multiple competing values. Media organizations argued for transparency and public awareness. Mental health professionals warned about secondary trauma from viewing graphic violence. Victim advocates questioned whether showing the footage respected the dignity of the deceased. Each perspective held valid concerns about the societal impact of broadcasting such material. Family members faced their own difficult position. Some wanted the footage released to show the truth of what happened. Others feared eternal circulation of their loved ones' final moments. This personal dimension added emotional weight to an already complex decision about public information versus private grief. The resolution came with controlled release to media outlets with appropriate warnings and editing. Selected segments showed the sequence of events without focusing on the most graphic moments. This compromise attempted to balance public information with sensitivity concerns, though it satisfied few completely. The delayed disclosure demonstrated how information vacuums affect public understanding. When official channels withhold visual evidence, unofficial narratives expand to fill the space. The weeks between incident and release allowed alternative explanations to establish footholds in public consciousness. The footage ultimately provided clarity about the attack's random nature and extreme violence. It showed the absence of provocation, the speed of the assault, the efforts of bystanders. This visual evidence became the definitive account against which all other descriptions could be measured. The dilemma reflects broader questions about violence documentation in the digital age. How much should the public see? Who decides what constitutes necessary information versus gratuitous content? These questions lack easy answers, particularly when the violence occurs in public spaces funded by taxpayer dollars. The security footage served its primary purpose as evidence, while creating secondary challenges around public disclosure. Its existence guaranteed accountability, but also forced difficult conversations about how society processes and distributes images of violence. The tension between truth-telling and trauma prevention remains unresolved in cases involving graphic visual evidence. How many warning signals can one person generate before intervention occurs? The suspect's history reveals multiple points where different outcomes might have been possible. Each encounter with authorities represented a potential turning point, a moment when comprehensive care could have altered his trajectory. Instead, these interactions became brief interruptions in a downward spiral, temporary pauses that never addressed underlying conditions. His family had repeatedly sought help from multiple agencies. They described his deteriorating mental state, his unpredictable behavior, his potential danger to himself and others. These pleas came from people who witnessed his decline firsthand, who understood the gap between his needs and available services. Their advocacy faced bureaucratic barriers, privacy restrictions, and systemic limitations that prevented meaningful intervention. They became helpless spectators to a crisis unfolding in slow motion. Previous involuntary commitments followed a predictable pattern. He would receive emergency psychiatric care until stabilized, and return to the community with minimal follow-up. The system focused on acute crisis management rather than long-term risk reduction. Stabilization meant he was no longer an immediate danger to himself, not that he was no longer a risk to others. This distinction created a dangerous gap between medical discharge and community safety. Research confirms that mental health systems often operate on crisis response models rather than preventive care. They address emergencies as they occur rather than preventing their occurrence. This approach creates a revolving door where individuals receive temporary help during worst moments but lack continuous support between crises. The focus remains on immediate danger rather than ongoing risk management. Coordination between mental health services, housing support, and law enforcement was fragmented at best. Information rarely flowed smoothly between systems. Treatment plans didn't connect with housing assistance. Law enforcement encounters didn't trigger mental health reviews. Each system operated within its own silo, addressing pieces of the problem without seeing the whole picture. This lack of integration meant warning signs remained isolated data points rather than connected patterns. Budget constraints and legal limitations created additional barriers. Funding shortages limited available beds, treatment options, and case management services. Legal protections designed to prevent unnecessary institutionalization sometimes prevented needed interventions. The balance between individual rights and public safety tilted toward minimal intervention until proven necessary. This cautious approach prioritized liberty over security until tragedy forced reconsideration. He fell through these systemic gaps repeatedly. Each missed opportunity represented a failure of coordination, funding, or policy. The consequences extended beyond his own suffering to impact complete strangers. The systems designed to protect both individuals and the public failed to connect in ways that might have prevented catastrophe. This case exemplifies how structural weaknesses can have deadly individual outcomes. The warning signs were there, but the systems weren't designed to read them as a coherent pattern of escalating risk. The tragedy lies not just in what happened, but in how many opportunities existed to prevent it. Imagine a life spiraling through systems never designed to catch it. DeCarlos Brown Jr.'s history before the August 2025 attack reads like a chronology of missed opportunities. His background shows multiple points where intervention could have changed everything. The pattern begins with minor offenses and escalates steadily, each incident more serious than the last, yet none triggering the comprehensive response needed. His extensive arrest record included charges for armed robbery and breaking and entering. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a progression, showing increasing disregard for legal boundaries. Each arrest represented a chance for intervention that never fully materialized. The system processed him through standard procedures without addressing the underlying issues driving his behavior. He moved through courtrooms and holding cells without meaningful rehabilitation. The schizophrenia diagnosis provided crucial context for his actions. Documented hallucinations and paranoia explained behavior that otherwise seemed random or malicious. Mental health professionals noted his distorted perceptions of reality, his inability to distinguish between actual threats and imagined dangers. This medical reality should have changed how the system approached his case, yet it often seemed like just another checkbox in his file. Previous aggression toward family members demonstrated the escalating nature of his condition. Relatives reported frightening behavior, unpredictable outbursts, and moments where he seemed completely detached from reality. These incidents led to involuntary commitments in mental health facilities, but the treatment never lasted long enough to create stability. Each release back into the community reset the cycle. The transition from housed to unhoused status marked a critical deterioration in his situation. Losing stable housing removed the last anchor of routine and support. Living on the streets exacerbated his mental health symptoms while reducing access to consistent care. The chaos of homelessness made medication compliance nearly impossible and increased his interactions with law enforcement. His criminal record created additional barriers to mental health treatment. Each arrest made it harder to access certain programs, housing options, and social services. The system treated his mental illness and criminal behavior as separate issues rather than interconnected problems needing coordinated solutions. This fragmentation ensured neither problem received adequate attention. The timing of his interactions with various systems created dangerous gaps. Mental health crisis teams saw him during acute episodes, but couldn't provide long-term care. Law enforcement encountered him during criminal acts, but lacked mental health training. Social services offered temporary solutions without addressing root causes. Each system worked in isolation, allowing him to fall through the cracks between them. Previous interventions followed standard protocols, but failed to account for his specific needs. Short-term hospitalizations stabilized immediate crises without creating lasting change. Probation supervision monitored compliance without addressing underlying mental health deterioration. Medication was prescribed, but not effectively managed in community settings. The treatment approach was fragmented and incomplete. The pattern shows clear escalation that should have triggered more intensive intervention. Minor property crimes progressed to violent offenses. Periodic instability became chronic homelessness. Occasional paranoia transformed into persistent psychosis. Each step represented an opportunity for comprehensive care that never arrived. His history demonstrates how multiple systems can fail simultaneously. Mental health services lacked the authority to mandate long-term treatment. Law enforcement focused on immediate offenses rather than underlying causes. Social services offered assistance that required stability he couldn't maintain. The very structure of these systems prevented effective coordination. This pattern of escalating behavior with inadequate response raises difficult questions about responsibility. At what point should the system have intervened more forcefully? How do we balance individual rights with community safety? When does repeated dangerous behavior justify more restrictive measures? These questions remain unanswered as similar cases continue to emerge. The tragedy lies in the predictability of the outcome. Given his history, his mental state, and the gaps in his care, violence became increasingly likely. The systems designed to prevent such outcomes instead became way stations in his deterioration. Each interaction documented the problem without solving it. Brown's history represents a failure cascade across multiple institutions. No single system bears full responsibility, yet collectively they failed to prevent a predictable tragedy. The documentation exists in arrest records, medical files, and social service reports, a paper trail of red flags that nobody connected into a coherent warning. Why did this local case attract federal attention almost immediately? The answer lies in the specific circumstances surrounding the crime and its implications for public safety across the entire transportation network. Local prosecutors moved quickly, filing first-degree murder charges within hours of the attack. This rapid response reflected the clear evidence available from security footage and witness statements. The charges represented the most serious option available under state law, signaling the gravity of the offense from the beginning. Then came the federal intervention. The U.S. Attorney General personally announced additional federal charges for killing on a mass transportation system. This rare move demonstrated how seriously federal authorities viewed the case. Their involvement signaled that this wasn't just another homicide. It represented a threat to national transit safety that demanded federal response. The personal attention from such a high-level official indicated the case's significance beyond typical criminal proceedings. The federal charge carries extraordinary consequences, including potential death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. This sentencing framework exists specifically for crimes that impact interstate commerce and national transportation systems. The penalty structure reflects how Congress views violence against mass transit, not just as crimes against individuals, but as attacks against public infrastructure that millions rely upon daily. Research shows federal involvement typically occurs in cases with interstate aspects or special jurisdictional significance. While this attack occurred within one state, the transportation system itself operates as part of national infrastructure. The movement of people across municipal boundaries, the federal funding supporting transit systems, and the broader implications for public safety all create grounds for federal jurisdiction. This legal reasoning allows federal prosecutors to address crimes that impact interstate commerce, even when they occur within single states. Prosecutors emphasize the public safety implications throughout their statements. They highlighted how violence on transit systems affects not just individual victims, but entire communities. Millions of Americans rely on public transportation daily for work, education, and essential services. Attacks on these systems create ripple effects of fear that extend far beyond any single city or state. This broader impact justified the federal government as unusual intervention in what might otherwise have remained a local case. The dual state and federal approach created multiple avenues for accountability and sentencing. This strategy ensured that even if one prosecution encountered legal challenges, the other could still proceed. It also allowed for potentially consecutive sentencing that reflected the full severity of the crime. The coordination between local and federal authorities demonstrated how different levels of government can work together to address particularly heinous offenses. This aggressive prosecution strategy reflected both the brutality of the crime and its public transportation context. The attack threatened not just one life, but the perceived safety of an entire mode of public transportation. The legal response needed to address both the individual tragedy and the broader implications for transit security nationwide. The chosen charges sent a clear message about how society should respond to violence in public spaces. The legal strategy would become as debated as the crime itself. Some questioned whether federal involvement was necessary, given the strong state case. Others argued the dual prosecution represented overreach or duplication of resources. Mental health advocates raised concerns about how the severe penalties addressed underlying systemic issues. These debates would continue throughout the legal process, reflecting larger questions about justice, mental health, and public safety. The federal charges also ensured the case would receive resources and attention beyond local capabilities. Federal prosecutors brought extensive experience with complex cases and access to specialized investigative resources. This elevated the prosecution's profile and guaranteed that the legal proceedings would be thorough and comprehensive. The involvement of multiple jurisdictions created a legal response that matched the significance of the crime. Picture trying to navigate severe mental illness without adequate support. The treatment infrastructure available to individuals like Brown operates as a fragmented system of temporary solutions. Emergency psychiatric holds provide short-term stabilization without long-term care. Outpatient clinics offer appointments that require stable housing and transportation. Community mental health centers struggle with wait lists and limited resources. This patchwork approach creates gaps where people in crisis inevitably fall through. The challenge of medicating someone who doesn't believe they re-ill represents a fundamental flaw in voluntary treatment models. When psychosis includes paranoia about medication itself, compliance becomes nearly impossible. Family members report watching loved ones deteriorate while legally powerless to intervene. The system requires people to recognize their own illness before providing meaningful help, creating a circular problem for those whose condition prevents self-awareness. The transition from institutional care to community-based support often fails at the handoff. Hospital discharges patients with prescription slips and follow-up appointments that assume stability and motivation. The reality involves complex medication regimens, transportation challenges, and the daily struggle of basic survival. Without intensive case management, these transitions become setups for failure rather than pathways to recovery. Homelessness complicates every aspect of treatment adherence. Without secure housing, medications get lost or stolen. Without refrigeration, some treatments become impossible. Without routine, taking medication at consistent times becomes chaotic. The environment of survival on streets exacerbates paranoia and undermines the stability that mental health treatment requires. Specific barriers to care for Black men with severe mental illness include cultural stigma, historical mistrust of medical systems, and racial disparities in diagnosis and treatment. Studies show Black men often receive more severe diagnoses and fewer treatment options than white patients with similar symptoms. This creates a double burden of managing severe illness while navigating systemic biases within the very systems meant to provide help. Previous interactions with social services followed predictable patterns. Crisis teams responded to emergencies, then closed cases when immediate danger passed. Hospitalizations provided temporary stabilization, then discharged patients to the same unsupported environments. Probation officers monitored compliance without addressing underlying mental health needs. Each service addressed part of the problem without seeing the whole picture. The mental health system operates on a series of assumptions that don't apply to severe cases. It assumes patients can advocate for themselves, keep appointments, maintain medication schedules, and recognize their own need for treatment. For individuals experiencing active psychosis, these assumptions become impossible barriers to care. The financial structure of mental health care creates additional obstacles. Medicaid reimbursement rates limit treatment options. Insurance approvals dictate treatment duration rather than clinical need. The focus becomes managing costs rather than managing illness. This economic reality shapes every decision about who gets care and for how long. The legal standards for involuntary treatment set an impossibly high bar. Most states require demonstrated immediate danger to self or others, meaning people must deteriorate to crisis points before intervention becomes possible. This reactive approach ensures treatment only happens after damage has already occurred. Coordination between systems remains consistently inadequate. Mental health providers, law enforcement, social services, and housing agencies operate in separate silos with different priorities and protocols. Information sharing restrictions prevent comprehensive case management. No single entity bears responsibility for the whole person. The resolution becomes painfully clear. The mental health system failed to provide the continuous care Brown needed, with tragic consequences for everyone involved. The gaps between diagnosis, treatment, and community supervision created conditions where violence became increasingly likely. This wasn't a single failure, but a series of systemic breakdowns across multiple institutions. The tragedy highlights the difference between temporary intervention and sustained care. Brief hospitalizations, occasional medication, and sporadic check-ins cannot manage severe, persistent mental illness. What's needed is continuous engagement, assertive community treatment, and wraparound services that address both mental health and basic needs. The system's limitations become most apparent in cases like this. When someone moves through multiple touchpoints without meaningful improvement, when red flags accumulate without triggering comprehensive response, when temporary fixes replace sustainable solutions. The pattern reveals structural weaknesses that affect countless individuals and communities. This failure has names and faces beyond just Brown and his victim. It represents thousands of people cycling through emergency rooms, jails, and shelters without receiving the care they need. The consequences play out in public spaces, family homes, and community settings every day. The question isn't whether the system failed, but how many times it must fail before we fundamentally change our approach to severe mental illness. What happens when violence goes viral while families still grieve? The security footage remained locked away for weeks, a decision that created a vacuum of speculation. Without visual evidence, theories multiplied across social platforms and neighborhood conversations. People questioned what authorities might be protecting or hiding, whether the attack was truly random or held hidden motives. This period of uncertainty allowed imagination to fill the absence of facts, creating narratives that often strayed from reality. When the video finally became public in early September, its spread was instantaneous. News networks broadcast edited segments with content warnings, while social media platforms hosted unedited versions that circulated without restraint. Viewers encountered the raw brutality of the attack without preparation or context. The footage showed every detail with chilling clarity: the sudden movement, the weapon's appearance, the immediate aftermath. This visual evidence made abstract violence uncomfortably concrete. Research confirms that violent content generates significantly more engagement than sanitized news reports. The human brain responds differently to visual evidence versus written or verbal accounts. This neurological reaction explains why the footage spread faster and further than any news article about the case. People clicked, shared, and commented in numbers that dwarfed engagement with more analytical coverage of the same events. The graphic nature sparked immediate debates about journalistic ethics. News directors faced difficult decisions about how much to show, when to warn viewers, and whether to broadcast such disturbing content at all. Trauma experts warned about secondary psychological harm to viewers, particularly those with personal experiences of violence. Mental health professionals noted how repeated viewing could normalize extreme brutality or trigger past trauma. Social platforms struggled with content moderation policies. Some sites attempted to remove the video for violating violence policies, while others allowed it to remain as news documentation. This inconsistent approach created confusion about constituted responsible sharing versus gratuitous distribution. The video's newsworthiness conflicted with platform rules designed to protect users from harmful content. The footage's impact on public perception proved more powerful than any official statement or written report. People who had previously dismissed the case as another crime statistic found themselves confronted with undeniable visual proof. The randomness of the violence, the speed of the attack, the helplessness of bystanders, these elements became inarguable when seen rather than described. The video made the tragedy feel immediate and personal to viewers thousands of miles away. This visual evidence also changed how people discussed the case. Before the release, conversations focused on abstract questions about public safety and mental health care. Afterward, discussions became more visceral, more urgent, more emotionally charged. The footage provided a common reference point that eliminated doubts about what had occurred on that train. The delayed release created an unusual sequence where people first heard about the tragedy, then weeks later saw it. This separation between learning about an event and witnessing it allowed for unusual psychological processing. The footage didn't just provide new information, it transformed existing understanding, turning theoretical knowledge into emotional experience. The video's circulation demonstrated how digital platforms amplify violence in ways traditional media cannot control. Once released, the footage took on a life of its own, spreading through networks and algorithms that prioritize engagement over sensitivity. This uncontrolled distribution meant the victim's family had to confront constant reminders of their loss, while the suspect's mental state became subject to public judgment without context. Ultimately, the footage served as both evidence and trauma, documentation and violation. It provided clarity about the crime's nature while creating new psychological wounds for those who viewed it. The tension between public right to know and personal right to dignity remained unresolved, reflecting broader questions about how society processes violence in the digital age. How quickly does human suffering become political ammunition? Almost immediately after this tragedy became public, partisan voices seized on the case to advance pre-existing agendas. The complex reality of what happened got reduced to simple talking points that served various ideological purposes. This exploitation began within hours of the initial news reports and intensified as more details emerged. Some commentators used Iryna's refugee status to argue about broader immigration policy failures. They framed her death as evidence of systemic problems with refugee resettlement or border security, despite her legal entry through established refugee programs. These arguments often ignored the actual circumstances of her arrival and the fact that she had followed all proper procedures to enter the country legally. Her personal story became a prop in debates she never chose to join. Others focused primarily on the suspect's race and mental health status to advance arguments about policing, urban governance, and public safety approaches. These discussions frequently omitted crucial context about mental health care access, homelessness services, and the complex intersection of these issues with racial disparities in treatment. The conversation became about proving points rather than understanding realities. Social media platforms amplified the most extreme interpretations. Racist memes and distorted narratives circulated alongside legitimate news coverage, often reaching wider audiences than factual reporting. Algorithm-driven platforms prioritized engagement over accuracy, rewarding sensational claims with greater visibility. This digital ecosystem turned tragedy into content, violence into virulence. Research indicates that high-profile crimes frequently become proxies for broader cultural and political conflicts. They serve as convenient examples for arguments about larger societal issues. even when the specific case doesn't perfectly fit the narrative. The emotional charge surrounding violent crime makes it particularly susceptible to this kind of ideological co-opting. The nuanced reality of mental health crisis, homelessness challenges, and public safety complexities got reduced to soundbite explanations. Complex systems failures became simple stories of individual evil or systemic breakdown. This oversimplification prevented meaningful discussion about the actual reforms needed to prevent similar tragedies. Throughout this political repurposing, both Iryna's humanity and the suspect's mental illness often got overshadowed. She became a symbol rather than a person, either of immigrant vulnerability or of system failure, depending on the narrative. His condition became either an excuse or an indictment, rarely understood as the complex medical reality it represented. The tragedy ultimately became less about what happened to specific people and more about what different groups believed it represented about society. This symbolic repurposing created competing versions of the same event, each serving different political objectives. The actual human cost, the lost life, the grieving family, the shattered community faded behind ideological positioning. This exploitation made sober analysis of prevention and reform significantly more difficult. When every fact becomes contested and every detail serves an agenda, finding common ground for solutions becomes nearly impossible. The polarization around the case reflected larger societal divisions about safety, mental health care, and public policy. The rapid political co-opting of personal tragedy represents a modern phenomenon where news cycles move faster than comprehension. There's no longer a period of reflection before interpretation begins. Analysis starts before all facts are known, and positions harden before the full picture emerges. This environment serves commentary at the expense of understanding. Ultimately, the exploitation of this tragedy demonstrates how difficult it has become to have nuanced public conversations about complex issues. When human suffering becomes political currency, everyone loses. The victims lose their humanity, the issues lose their complexity, and society loses the opportunity for meaningful progress. The noise of ideology drowns out the signal of truth. Consider the procedural response to a brutal public crime. The train continued to the next station, where transit police and local law enforcement established a perimeter. They detained the suspect without significant resistance, his movements slowed by whatever mental state had driven the violence. The immediate apprehension followed standard protocols for containing a potentially dangerous individual while preserving evidence and witness statements. The balance between immediate apprehension and preserving rights became immediately relevant. Officers read Miranda rights while securing the scene, documenting the suspect's condition and statements. They maintained custody without using excessive force, following procedures designed to protect both public safety and constitutional protections. This careful approach ensured the legal process would not be compromised by rushed actions. Initial charges included first-degree murder and weapons violations. The federal charge related to violence on mass transportation would come later, adding another layer of legal consequences. Evidence collection began immediately with the weapon, clothing, and any personal items in the suspect's possession. The clear nature of the security footage made the charges straightforward from a legal standpoint. The declaration of death at the scene came from paramedics after assessing vital signs. The coroner's office assumed jurisdiction over the body, beginning the process of official identification and autopsy. This medical legal procedure would document the exact nature of the injuries and confirm the cause of death. The formal pronouncement triggered additional protocols for evidence preservation and investigation. Notification of family members followed established procedures for death notifications. Police visited the family home with a translator, delivering the devastating news in person. Consular officials received notification as required for foreign nationals, beginning the process of international coordination. These difficult conversations represented the human impact behind the procedural response. Securing the crime scene involved multiple agencies coordinating efforts. Transit police secured the train car, while local police managed the station area. Crime scene investigators documented every detail: blood patterns, weapon placement, passenger positions. Witness interviews began immediately while memories remained fresh, with officers collecting contact information for follow-up discussions. Transit operations continued around the investigation with minimal disruption. Other trains passed through the station on adjusted schedules. Passengers diverted around the secured area. The system's priority became balancing thorough investigation with maintaining public transportation services. This operational reality meant the routine movement of people continued just feet from where a life had ended. The resolution highlights a troubling contradiction. The immediate arrest reflected excellent police work based on clear evidence. Officers followed protocols perfectly in responding to the violence. Yet this efficient response raised unavoidable questions about prevention. How could someone with this history of mental health crises and previous arrests access public transit without any monitoring or intervention? The systems designed to respond to violence functioned exactly as intended, but the systems designed to prevent violence failed completely. This gap between reactive capability and preventive failure becomes the central question of the case. The arrest represents both successful law enforcement and systemic breakdown simultaneously. The procedural response shows society's ability to handle the aftermath of violence with precision and care. Every step followed established guidelines for serious crimes. The coordination between agencies, the evidence collection, the suspect processing, all demonstrated professional competence. Yet this competence addresses only the consequences, not the causes. The question lingers long after the handcuffs click shut. Why does our system wait for tragedy to occur before taking comprehensive action? The efficiency of the response contrasts sharply with the inefficiency of prevention. We've mastered the art of cleaning up after violence while struggling with the science of preventing it. This tension between response and prevention defines the tragedy. The immediate aftermath shows what happens when systems work correctly. The larger context shows what happens when they don't work soon enough. The arrest provides closure for the incident, but not for the underlying problems it represents. What do the numbers actually say about transit safety? Public perception often conflicts with statistical reality when it comes to crime and risk assessment. Despite this high-profile tragedy, Charlotte's crime data told a different story about overall safety trends in the city during that period. The statistics revealed improvements in multiple categories that contrasted sharply with the public fear generated by this single incident. Violent crime had decreased significantly in the first half of the year compared to the same period in the previous year. Homicides showed an even more substantial reduction, reflecting broader positive trends in public safety. These improvements occurred alongside increased ridership on public transportation systems as pandemic concerns eased and commuting patterns normalized. The data suggested the city was becoming safer overall, not more dangerous. National transportation safety statistics reinforced this pattern. Public transit homicide rates had been declining since their pandemic-era spikes, returning to pre-2020 levels in most metropolitan areas. The overall risk of violence on mass transportation remained extremely low when considered statistically. These numbers represented millions of uneventful journeys for every violent incident that occurred. Research consistently shows that driving personal vehicles remains statistically more dangerous than using public transit across most safety metrics. The risk of fatal accidents, injuries, and other serious incidents is significantly higher for private automobile travel than for public transportation. This reality rarely receives the same media attention or public concern as transit violence, despite affecting far more people each year. Media coverage patterns help explain this perception gap. Dramatic but rare events like transit attacks receive extensive news attention, while routine traffic fatalities receive minimal coverage. This selective reporting creates a distorted sense of risk, making unusual events seem more common than they actually are. The emotional impact of brutal violence outweighs statistical probability in shaping public fear. Transit officials noted that their systems facilitated millions of safe rides for every violent incident that occurred. The mathematical probability of experiencing violence on public transportation remained extremely low for the average rider. This statistical reality rarely comforted people who had seen security footage or read detailed accounts of attacks. Numbers struggled to compete with visceral emotional responses. The emotional impact of this particular case dramatically outweighed statistical reality in analysis, shaping public fear and policy discussions. People responded to what they felt rather than what the data showed. This disconnect between perception and reality would ultimately influence policy responses and resource allocation in ways that didn't always align with actual risk levels. The tension between statistical safety and perceived danger creates ongoing challenges for public transportation systems. They must address both actual security needs and public perception concerns, which don't always align. This case demonstrated how a single incident could override years of positive data and reshape community attitudes toward public spaces. The aftermath would show whether policy responses would be guided by emotion or evidence, by rare extremes or common realities. The statistical truth remained that public transportation was significantly safer than many people believed. But belief often proves stronger than truth when fear takes hold. This disconnect would influence everything from security budgets to ridership patterns in the months that followed. What happens when hope becomes grief? For Iryna's family, surviving war was only the beginning of their struggle. They had escaped bombardment and displacement, only to face a different kind of loss in their new country. A sudden, violent death that shattered everything they had worked to rebuild. Her mother, sister, and brother now mourned not just a relative, but the shared future they had envisioned together in America. Their collective dream fractured into individual sorrow. Picture investing everything in building a new life, only to have the foundation collapse unexpectedly. The family's entire resettlement strategy had relied on mutual support and shared contributions. Iryna's income from the pizzeria provided essential financial stability, while her improving language skills helped navigate bureaucratic systems and community integration. She had become the family's bridge to their new environment, translating both language and culture for older relatives. Her earnings helped pay for groceries. Her language ability helped complete government forms. Her optimism helped sustain everyone's spirits during difficult transitions. Research into refugee trauma shows how new losses compound previous hardships. Each tragedy builds upon the last, creating layers of grief that become increasingly difficult to process. Surviving war requires one kind of resilience. Burying a child in a foreign country requires another entirely. The family faced not only their personal sorrow, but the practical challenges of navigating unfamiliar legal systems, unfamiliar funeral customs, and unfamiliar support networks during their worst possible moments. Their private grief became public property almost immediately. Media attention intensified their pain, with reporters seeking comments and cameras documenting their mourning. Community support provided some comfort, but couldn't replace what they had lost. Meals from neighbors didn't restore their daughter's laughter. Donated funds couldn't rebuild their shattered future. Condolences in broken English couldn't bridge the gap between sympathy and understanding. The future they had imagined together, steady jobs, educational achievements, eventual citizenship, vanished in an instant. Iryna's veterinary studies would never be completed. Her dream of helping animals would never be realized. The family's gradual climb toward stability reversed direction abruptly. They faced not only emotional devastation, but practical uncertainty about how to continue without her contributions. Iryna's story transformed from personal tragedy to public symbol. She became representative of both refugee hope and refugee vulnerability. Her success at adapting to American life demonstrated what was possible through determination and hard work. Her violent death demonstrated how quickly that success could be destroyed by random circumstance. This dual symbolism made her story resonate beyond her immediate community, turning private loss into public conversation. Their personal experience became a lens for examining larger systemic issues. The tragedy raised questions about mental health care access, public transportation security, and support systems for refugee families. The very specificity of their loss created opportunities for broader discussions about prevention and protection. Their grief, while intensely personal, became connected to public policy in ways they never could have anticipated. The family's journey through multiple traumas, war, displacement, violent loss highlighted both human resilience and systemic failures. They had survived incredible hardship, only to encounter a different kind of danger in their supposed place of safety. This ironic tragedy underscored how vulnerability can persist even after escape, how safety can remain elusive even when found. Their story became a reminder that survival requires more than just reaching safety. It requires being able to stay safe. How does a city mourn a stranger? Charlotte answered this question through vigils, impromptu memorials, and sustained public dialogue about safety. Residents organized candlelight gatherings at transit stations, creating spaces for collective grief and reflection. These events drew people who had never met Iryna, but saw themselves in her story, her commute, her aspirations, her vulnerability. The attack felt personal to anyone who had ever ridden public transportation after dark or pursued dreams in an unfamiliar country. Refugee communities experienced particular resonance with the tragedy. Many saw Iryna's journey mirroring their own fleeing danger, only to encounter different risks in their new home. This shared experience created a sense of collective vulnerability that extended beyond any single ethnic community. New Americans who had relied on public transit as a lifeline to jobs and opportunities now questioned its safety. The violence challenged their hard-won sense of security in their adopted city. Regular transit riders reported changed behaviors following the attack. People described increased awareness of their surroundings, hesitation about sitting near strangers, and renewed attention to emergency features on trains. Some began carrying personal safety devices or arranging alternative transportation for evening travel. This heightened caution reflected how a single incident can reshape public perception of risk, regardless of statistical probabilities. Research into community responses to high-profile crimes shows they often trigger solidarity and mobilization. Charlotte demonstrated this pattern through organized advocacy groups forming around transit safety and mental health reform. Community meetings drew residents demanding concrete changes rather than symbolic gestures. This mobilization represented civic engagement born from tragedy, turning grief into action. Local officials faced dual pressures from these developments. They needed to address immediate safety concerns through visible security measures, while also confronting underlying systemic issues around mental health care and homelessness. The public demanded both quick fixes and long-term solutions, creating challenging policy dilemmas. Temporary security increases satisfied few, while comprehensive reforms required time and resources that strained municipal budgets. Zepede's Pizzeria became an informal memorial site where customers left flowers, notes, and small tokens of remembrance. The restaurant where Iryna worked her final shift transformed into a place of pilgrimage for those touched by her story. Colleagues shared memories with visitors, creating oral histories that complemented the official narrative. This grassroots memorialization demonstrated how tragedy can transform ordinary spaces into sacred ground. The conversations sparked by this case extended far beyond the specific incident. Community discussions addressed broader questions about public space design, crisis intervention training for transit staff, and coordination between social services and law enforcement. These dialogues connected Iryna's tragedy to larger patterns of violence prevention and mental health care access. This community engagement ultimately influenced policy discussions at multiple levels. Transit security reviews, mental health service evaluations, and refugee support assessments all gained momentum from public pressure. The tragedy created political will for reforms that advocates had sought for years without success. The collective response demonstrated how personal loss can drive systemic change when channeled through organized civic action. Can we prevent violence without sacrificing compassion? This case forces us to confront the difficult balance between public safety and individual rights. The suspect's history represents countless individuals cycling through systems that address symptoms rather than causes. We face fundamental questions about how society should respond to severe mental illness when it intersects with potential violence. Involuntary treatment presents particularly complex ethical challenges. Civil liberties protections exist for good reason to prevent inappropriate institutionalization and protect personal autonomy. Yet these same protections can prevent intervention until someone demonstrates clear danger to themselves or others. That threshold often means waiting until after harm has occurred rather than preventing it proactively. Earlier intervention requires resources and legal frameworks that currently don't exist in most communities. Effective prevention means having teams that can respond to warning signs before crises develop. It requires housing options that provide stability for treatment adherence. It demands coordination between mental health professionals, law enforcement, and social services that's rare in practice, though common in theory. Crisis response systems typically lack capacity for ongoing care after initial stabilization. Emergency psychiatric holds address immediate danger, but rarely connect to long-term support. Patients receive medication and stabilization, then return to the same environments that contributed to their deterioration. The transition from crisis care to community support represents the system's weakest point. Research clearly shows that properly funded community mental health services reduce violence risks significantly. Programs offering continuous case management, assertive community treatment, and supported housing demonstrate measurable success. These approaches address both mental health needs and practical challenges like housing, employment, and social connection that affect stability. Stigma and funding limitations constantly undermine comprehensive care. Mental health services often face budget cuts during economic downturns, precisely when needs increase. Public support for mental health funding rarely matches the urgency of physical health crises, despite similar impacts on lives and communities. This underinvestment ensures systems remain reactive rather than preventive. The criminal justice system has become the default mental health provider for many individuals. Jails and prisons now house more people with severe mental illness than psychiatric hospitals. Law enforcement officers spend significant time responding to mental health crises rather than crime prevention. This misallocation of resources helps nobody, not patients, not officers, not communities. This case highlights the critical need for better coordination between health, housing, and justice systems. Information sharing restrictions, separate funding streams, and different priorities prevent comprehensive care. Successful models show that integrated approaches reduce costs while improving outcomes across all measures. The fragmentation we accept as normal represents a policy choice, not an inevitability. Solutions require both increased resources and thoughtful policy reforms. More funding alone won't fix broken systems, but neither will policy changes without adequate investment. We need legal frameworks that allow earlier intervention while protecting civil liberties. We need funding models that reward prevention rather than crisis response. We need cross-system coordination that puts patient needs ahead of bureaucratic boundaries. The status quo satisfies nobody. It fails people with mental illness, their families, and their communities. It leaves individuals without adequate treatment and communities without adequate protection. This case represents the human cost of our collective failure to address severe mental illness with compassion and competence. The solutions exist. What's missing is the will to implement them. How safe should public spaces really be? Public transit presents unique security challenges, unlike any other environment. These systems require balancing openness with protection in ways that airports or government buildings don't face. Transit systems must remain accessible to all while ensuring passenger safety, creating constant tension between convenience and security. The solutions aren't simple or inexpensive. The Lynx Blue Line relied primarily on surveillance cameras during evening hours. These cameras provided documentation after incidents occurred, but little prevention during them. Visible security presence was minimal during off-peak times when ridership decreased, but risks potentially increased. This approach prioritized cost efficiency over proactive protection, following patterns seen in many transit systems nationwide. Other transportation networks employ different strategies. Some use random patrols by uniformed and plainclothes officers. Others install emergency communication buttons throughout stations and vehicles. Certain systems increase staffing during historically high-risk periods, like weekend evenings or special events. Each approach carries different costs, different benefits, and different impacts on passenger experience. Research consistently shows that perceived safety matters as much as statistical safety for ridership numbers. Passengers avoid systems they perceive as dangerous regardless of actual crime rates. This perception affects economic viability, public support, and community connectivity. Transit agencies must address both reality and appearance when designing security measures, a challenging dual responsibility. Cost constraints constantly limit security enhancements. Transit systems operate with tight budgets and competing priorities. Security improvements often compete with maintenance needs, service expansion, and affordability concerns. The most effective measures: increased staffing, advanced technology. Structural redesigns require significant investment that many systems cannot afford without cutting other essential services. Technological solutions present their own complications. AI monitoring systems can detect unusual behavior patterns but raise privacy concerns and require sophisticated infrastructure. Facial recognition technology offers potential security benefits, but creates ethical dilemmas about surveillance and civil liberties. Every technological solution involves trade-offs between security, privacy, and practical implementation. The public often demands visible security improvements after tragedies. Increased police presence, weapon screenings, or access restrictions provide psychological reassurance. However, these measures may not address the most common safety issues transit systems face. The most effective approaches often combine visible security with less obvious interventions, like better lighting, emergency training for staff, and community engagement programs. This tragedy forced reconsideration of what constitutes adequate protection in public transportation. The discussion expanded beyond traditional security measures to include mental health outreach, homelessness services, and community support systems. The most comprehensive approaches recognize that transit safety involves more than just policing. It requires addressing the social factors that contribute to violence. The answers involve both practical security measures and broader social interventions. Physical improvements like better lighting, clear sightlines, and emergency systems provide immediate protection. Longer-term solutions require addressing root causes like mental health care access, substance abuse treatment, and economic inequality. Transit safety cannot be separated from community health. Effective security requires balancing multiple competing values. Systems must remain open and accessible while providing protection. They must respect privacy while ensuring safety. They must address both immediate threats and underlying causes. There are no perfect solutions, only careful compromises that reflect community values and practical realities. The conversation continues about where to draw these lines. How much security is enough? How much freedom are we willing to trade for safety? These questions lack easy answers, but demand serious consideration. The future of public transportation depends on finding the right balance between openness and protection, between individual rights and collective safety. Why did this local case become a federal priority? The answer lies in how the crime intersected with national interests far beyond Charlotte's city limits. Federal prosecutors recognize that violence on public transportation affects not just individual communities, but the entire nation's infrastructure. These systems connect cities, move workers across state lines, and receive federal funding, making them matters of interstate commerce and national concern. The Justice Department's involvement signaled that this wasn't just another homicide case. Federal jurisdiction applied because mass transportation systems operate as part of national infrastructure, with routes that often cross state boundaries and funding that comes from federal sources. This legal interpretation allows federal prosecutors to address crimes that impact interstate commerce, even when the violence itself occurs within a single state. The severity of available penalties under federal law created additional sentencing options beyond state provisions. While North Carolina could pursue the death penalty for first-degree murder, federal charges related to violence on mass transportation carry their own severe consequences. These parallel legal paths ensured multiple avenues for accountability, with potential sentences that could extend beyond what state law alone provided. This approach guaranteed the case would receive resources and attention beyond local capabilities. Federal investigators brought specialized experience with complex violent crimes and access to forensic resources that might exceed local capacities. The involvement of federal agencies meant more personnel, more technical expertise, and more sustained focus on achieving justice. The messaging from federal officials focused heavily on maximum penalties and permanent removal from society. Their public statements emphasized the need for consequences that would prevent future danger to the public. This tough stance reflected both the crime's brutality and its occurrence in a space where people should feel secure going about their daily lives. The federal strategy acknowledged the symbolic importance of protecting public transportation. When violence occurs in spaces that millions use daily, it undermines public confidence in essential infrastructure. The response needed to address both the specific crime and its broader implications for how people move through their communities. This case would influence how similar incidents might be handled in the future. The federal government's assertive stance set a precedent for intervening in local cases involving mass transportation violence. It demonstrated that certain crimes, due to their location and impact, warrant national attention and resources, regardless of where they occur. The coordination between state and federal prosecutors represented a model for handling complex cases. While operating under different legal frameworks, they pursued complementary strategies that reinforced each other. This cooperation ensured that legal technicalities wouldn't prevent appropriate consequences for the crime. The federal perspective also addressed the nationwide concern about random violence in public spaces. By taking such a strong stance, authorities signaled that attacks on communal infrastructure would be treated with particular seriousness. This approach aimed to reassure the public while demonstrating government commitment to transportation safety. Ultimately, the federal involvement reflected how seriously the government views threats to public transportation systems. These networks form the circulatory system of urban America, moving workers, students, and families through their daily lives. Disrupting that flow through violence strikes at the heart of how cities function and how people connect. The legal strategy balanced immediate accountability with long-term prevention. The severe penalties sought would both punish the specific crime and deter future violence through demonstration of consequences. This dual approach addressed both justice for what happened and protection against what might happen elsewhere. This case would become a reference point for future discussions about jurisdiction, sentencing, and public safety. It demonstrated how different levels of government can coordinate to address crimes that transcend local boundaries while serving broader public interests. The federal perspective ensured this tragedy would be remembered not just as a local crime, but as a national concern. What mysteries remain about that August night, despite all we've documented? The security footage provides clear visual evidence of what happened. It leaves fundamental questions about why it happened. The suspect's specific motivations remain obscured by his mental state, creating a void where rational explanation should exist. Without any prior connection between them, without any apparent provocation, the violence seems to emerge from some internal landscape only he could access. The timing and location of the attack appear completely random rather than targeted or planned. He didn't choose a particularly isolated station or an empty car. The train was moving through a well-lit urban area with other passengers present. This absence of logical selection makes the event feel even more unsettling. If violence can strike anywhere, anytime, without pattern or reason, then nowhere feels truly safe. Witness accounts vary regarding what precisely triggered the violence and when exactly it began. Some recall subtle movements before the attack. Others remember only the sudden production of the knife. These inconsistencies reflect how trauma affects memory and perception. Under extreme stress, people notice different details, focus on different aspects, remember sequences differently. The complete picture may never be fully reconstructed from human recollection alone. Research into similar cases shows that mentally ill perpetrators often operate from distorted motivations that defy rational analysis. Their internal logic follows pathways invisible to outside observation. What makes sense within their psychological reality may appear completely senseless to everyone else. This gap between internal experience and external understanding creates permanent questions about causation and intent. The security footage, while comprehensive for the attack itself, leaves questions about what preceded the recorded moments. What thoughts occupied his mind before boarding? What interactions occurred at previous stations? The cameras capture actions, but not internal states, movements, but not motivations. This evidentiary boundary means some aspects of the timeline remain forever unknown. The effectiveness of bystander response continues to be debated among experts. Could different actions have changed the outcome? Was intervention possible given the attack's speed and brutality? These questions involve complex calculations about reaction time, situational awareness, and personal risk assessment. There are no clear answers, only difficult hypotheticals about moments that pass too quickly for conscious decision-making. Some aspects of human behavior during mental health crises may never be fully understandable to those outside that experience. The intersection of psychosis, past trauma, and current circumstances creates complexities that resist simple explanations. We can document what happened, but comprehending why requires access to a mind that operated by different rules than our own. These unanswered questions make prevention and intervention even more challenging. If we cannot understand the motivations behind such violence, how can we hope to prevent it? If we cannot predict where it will occur, how can we protect against it? The mystery becomes part of the tragedy, not just that it happened, but that we may never fully understand why it happened in this particular way at this particular time. The lack of clear answers forces us to confront the limits of our systems and our understanding. We want violence to make sense, to follow patterns, to be preventable through analysis and intervention. Random brutality challenges these assumptions, reminding us that some events resist neat explanations or easy solutions. This uncomfortable reality may be the most difficult aspect to accept. The questions that remain unanswered become part of the story's legacy. They linger in courtroom consultations, policy discussions, and personal reflections. They shape how we remember what happened and how we prepare for what might happen next. Some mysteries persist not because of investigative failure, but because human behavior itself contains elements that transcend simple explanation. This case leaves us with the sobering realization that despite all our documentation, all our analysis, all our systems and protocols, some aspects of human tragedy remain fundamentally unknowable. We can establish what occurred, who was involved, and how events unfolded, but the deepest why may forever escape our grasp. That limitation itself becomes a crucial part of understanding both the crime and our response to it. What changes might prevent another tragedy? In response to public pressure, officials proposed multiple reforms and reviews that attempted to address both immediate security concerns and underlying systemic failures. Transit authorities promised increased patrols during evening hours, improved lighting at stations, and enhanced emergency communication systems on board trains. These visible measures aim to reassure the public while addressing specific vulnerabilities highlighted by the attack. Mental health advocates pushed for more comprehensive reforms beyond transit security. They called for improved crisis intervention teams, expanded community-based treatment options, and better coordination between mental health services and law enforcement. Their proposals focused on preventing violence by addressing root causes rather than just responding to its consequences. This approach recognized that security measures alone cannot solve problems stemming from untreated mental illness. Research consistently shows that comprehensive approaches work better than isolated interventions. Effective prevention requires combining immediate security improvements with long-term mental health care solutions. This dual approach addresses both the environment where violence occurs and the factors that contribute to violent behavior. Singular solutions, whether more police or more therapists, rarely succeed when implemented alone. Coordination between agencies presents significant practical challenges. Different systems operate with separate mandates, funding streams, and priorities. Law enforcement focuses on public safety, mental health services on patient care, transit authorities on transportation efficiency. Bridging these divides requires structural changes that existing bureaucracies often resist. Information sharing restrictions, budget limitations, and jurisdictional boundaries all complicate coordination efforts. Funding constraints consistently limit implementation of even the most well-intentioned reform proposals. Transit systems operate with tight budgets that prioritize operational costs over security enhancements. Mental health services face constant pressure to serve more people with limited resources. Comprehensive reforms require investment that competes with other essential services, creating difficult choices for policymakers. The most promising approaches recognize that these issues are interconnected. Homelessness, mental health care access, and public safety cannot be addressed in isolation. Effective solutions require coordinated efforts across multiple systems and agencies. This means breaking down silos between transportation, healthcare, social services, and law enforcement to create integrated responses. Sustainable prevention demands addressing all these elements simultaneously. Temporary security increases may provide short-term reassurance, but cannot prevent similar tragedies long-term. Likewise, mental health reforms alone cannot ensure public safety without environmental protections. The most effective strategies combine immediate protections with systemic changes that address underlying causes. The true test will be whether these reforms outlast the immediate outrage following the tragedy. History shows that public attention fades quickly, and funding often follows attention. Maintaining momentum for comprehensive change requires sustained political will and community engagement. Without ongoing pressure, proposed reforms often become diluted or abandoned entirely. Many cities face similar challenges with public safety and mental health care. The solutions being proposed here could serve as models for other communities grappling with these complex issues. However, successful implementation requires adapting general principles to local contexts, resources, and needs. What works in one city may need modification for another. Proposed reforms represent an opportunity to create meaningful change from tragedy. They offer the possibility of preventing future violence while improving care for those with mental illness. However, turning proposals into reality requires navigating complex political, financial, and practical obstacles. The commitment to follow through will determine whether this tragedy becomes a catalyst for improvement or just another statistic. The conversation about prevention continues as these proposals move through various approval processes. Community input, expert analysis, and political negotiation will shape the final outcomes. The hope remains that something positive can emerge from loss, that systems can be improved, that future tragedies might be prevented through thoughtful action and sustained commitment to comprehensive solutions. What remains when the headlines fade and public attention moves elsewhere? Both Iryna Zarutska and DeCarlos Brown Jr. represent larger stories that extend far beyond their individual tragedies. Her experience reflects the hope and profound vulnerability of refugees who flee danger, only to encounter different risks in their search for safety. His story illustrates the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness when it intersects with systemic failures across multiple institutions. Their brief intersection on that train represents not just random chance, but the collision point of numerous policy shortcomings and social challenges that remain largely unaddressed. Research into high-profile cases consistently shows they generate temporary attention that rarely translates into sustained reform. The initial outrage fades, the media coverage decreases, and the political will diminishes as newer tragedies capture public concern. This pattern repeats across countless similar incidents, leaving fundamental problems unresolved despite temporary bursts of activism and promises of change. The cycle of attention and neglect ensures that underlying issues persist long after specific cases leave the spotlight. The families of both individuals continue living with the consequences long after cameras turn elsewhere. Iryna's relatives mourn not just their loss, but the future that was stolen, the career she would have built, the family she might have started, the contributions she would have made to her new community. Brown's family grapples with their own complex grief, wrestling with questions about what more could have been done and whether different interventions might have prevented this outcome. Their private suffering continues unnoticed as public discussion moves on. Real change requires addressing root causes rather than just symptoms of larger problems. Enhanced transit security might prevent similar attacks in specific locations, but it doesn't address why individuals reach points of crisis. Improved mental health care could help those struggling with severe illness, but it requires funding and coordination that often doesn't materialize. Comprehensive solutions must connect these dots, recognizing that public safety and mental health are intertwined issues needing integrated responses. This tragedy ultimately reminds us that both public safety and mental health care are fundamentally about protecting human dignity. They're about ensuring people can move through their communities without fear, and that those struggling with illness receive care rather than punishment. The measurement of a society as compassion lies in how it treats its most vulnerable members, both those seeking safety and those unable to care for themselves. The most meaningful legacy would be preventing similar tragedies through comprehensive reform. This requires sustained effort beyond the initial shock and outrage. It demands that we maintain focus on these issues, even when they're no longer front-page news. The true test isn't how we respond in the immediate aftermath, but whether we continue working toward solutions when the attention has faded and the work becomes difficult. Their stories don't have to be just another case study in systemic failure. They could become catalysts for genuine improvement in how we handle mental health crises, refugee integration, and public safety. That possibility represents the best possible outcome from such a devastating loss, that other families might be spared similar pain because we learned how to do better. The conversation continues about how to honor these intersecting legacies. Some advocate for policy changes, others for increased funding, still others for community-based solutions. The common thread is the recognition that our current systems failed both these individuals, and that failure affected an entire community. The work ahead involves building systems that protect everyone's dignity while addressing the complex realities of mental illness and public safety. Their names may fade from public discussion, but the questions their stories raise remain relevant to communities everywhere. How we answer those questions will determine whether this tragedy becomes just another statistic or the catalyst for meaningful change that makes everyone safer. Iryna Zarutska's story represents extraordinary resilience and devastating vulnerability. Her death exposes critical gaps in how society protects vulnerable newcomers and treats severe mental illness. Real public safety requires more than reactive measures. It demands addressing both immediate security and deep systemic failures. This tragedy reminds us that compassion and prevention must guide our policies as much as security and justice. Without meaningful reform, we risk repeating the same patterns that failed both Iryna and her attacker. Their stories challenge us to build systems that value every life and prevent such senseless loss from happening again.